They say your life flashes before your eyes in your final moments. But sometimes it starts to unfold in slow motion while you're still alive, right in front of the people you love the most, or thought you did. My name is Evelyn Barrett, and on the evening of my 75th birthday, I smiled for photographs, raised glasses of champagne, and nodded politely at guests I hadn't seen in decades, all while my heart cracked quietly in two. The party was held in the coastal home I designed with my late husband Henry nearly 45 years ago, a 2-story modern craftsman with wide windows opening to the ocean breeze of Carmel by the sea, the scent of salt and lavender mingling in the air like a memory refusing to fade. That house held echoes of my children's laughter, holiday dinners, with Henry's jazz playing low in the background, and late nights spent drafting designs long after the rest of the world had gone to bed. But that evening, it didn't feel like my home anymore. As the guests mingled in the candlelit living room, adorned with pale peonies and the subtle clink of glassware, I excused myself quietly. My legs ached more than usual, and the faint dizziness that had plagued me since autumn returned with a low hum. I passed the grand piano and traced my fingers along the edge, steadying myself as I walked down the corridor toward the guest bathroom. That's when I heard it. A voice. Delicate, icy, effortlessly cruel. "I hope this is her last one," my daughter-in-law murmured, her voice floating through the half-open study door like a silk scarf catching the wind. I froze, every muscle in my body suddenly still. "Honestly," she continued with a lilting laugh, "I already picked the wallpaper for her studio. It's going to be a fabulous dressing room, velvet seating, floor-to-ceiling mirrors. It'll be the best closet in California." There was a moment of silence. Then another voice, calm, masculine, colder than I ever imagined it could be. "Dr. Lane says her heart probably won't last much longer," said my son, Daniel. "And once it's over, the property transfers automatically." The words hit like the crack of lightning. I staggered back slightly, one hand gripping the hallway sconce for balance. My heartbeat, ironically, roared in my ears, thudding in defiance. How had we come to this? My only child, my Daniel. The same boy who used to bring me tea when I worked, late, who once cried when I missed his school play, now quietly counting the minutes to my demise, for square footage and marble flooring. I adjusted my spine, straightened my shawl. 40 years in architecture had taught me how to stay composed under pressure. I'd stood in front of hostile city boards, skeptical investors, and grieving families. But nothing had prepared me for this. The betrayal not of strangers, but of blood. I stepped back silently and made my way to the powder room. There, beneath the soft hum of the ventilation fan and the distant murmur of jazz and laughter from the living room, I stared into the mirror. My reflection looked back at me. Silver hair swept elegantly, lips still painted rosewood, eyes tired, but unbroken. I was still here, and I was not done. That night, as the guests sang and toasted, and Daniel raised his glass to the strongest woman he knew, I smiled. But inside, a storm had begun to rise. A quiet storm, steady and deliberate. They thought I wouldn't last the year. They forgot who built the foundation they now walked on. And if you're here listening to this story, perhaps you've stood in the shadows of someone else's selfishness, too. If so, stay with me. And please take a moment to subscribe. These stories, our stories, deserve to be heard. That night, after the last candle flickered out and the guests had gone, I sat alone in my bedroom, wrapped in a shawl older than my marriage vows. The once warm glow of celebration had faded, leaving a silence thick as smoke. I stared at the ceiling fan turning lazily above me, its rhythm too steady for the chaos inside my chest. Betrayal leaves a strange taste in the mouth, bitter, metallic, almost medicinal. I felt it sitting on my tongue as I replayed Rebecca's voice in my mind, looping like a cruel lullaby. I hope this is her last one. I pressed my hand to my heart, not out of melodrama, but to feel the beat for myself, reassurance that I was still here, still breathing, still capable. The next morning, the house smelled of leftover cake and floral arrangements beginning to wilt. Daniel and Rebecca had left early, as they often did after hosting something. They loved appearances, not cleanup. As I sat at the breakfast nook, sunlight spilling through the lace curtains, Lillian entered with a steaming cup of Earl Grey. Lillian had been with me for 30 years, longer than Rebecca, longer than most friendships. Her hands, rough from years of housekeeping and cooking, trembled slightly as she placed the cup on the table. "You slept lightly," she said softly, eyes studying mine. "I heard you walking at midnight." I hesitated. My voice cracked with hesitation. "I heard them, Lillian, last night, what they really think of me." Her hand rested on mine. "I always knew something wasn't right, but I didn't want to speak unless you saw it yourself." There was no need for more words. Loyalty doesn't always come with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it's in the silence, in staying. "I need your help," I said, my voice quieter than a whisper. "And I need you to believe me when I say this might get complicated." Her gaze did not waver. "I believe you." And just like that, the first brick of my new foundation was laid, not made of stone or steel, but of trust. That afternoon, I stepped into the small sunroom at the back of the house, my former studio, which Rebecca now dreamed of converting, into a fabulous closet. Dust motes floated in the light like tiny spirits dancing in rebellion. I pulled the heavy door closed behind me and stared at the old landline mounted beside my drafting table. It hadn't rung in years, and I hadn't used it in nearly a decade. Still, I picked up the receiver and dialed a number I hadn't forgotten, even though I told myself I had. "Victor?" There was silence. Then a voice I knew down to the marrow. "Evie?" he said, cautiously. "Victor Morales." Once the love I gave up for the family I thought I was building. A brilliant landscape architect with a mind like fire and hands that once traced blueprints alongside mine like they were maps to a shared dream. I had walked away from him when Daniel was 10, believing stability mattered more than passion. I chose Henry. I chose my firm. I chose the idea of family. Now I was calling not just to reopen a door, but to tear down a wall. "I need your help," I said. He didn't ask why. Didn't lecture, didn't gloat. "Is this about the land use project we designed in '97? He said after a pause, his tone suddenly alert. "The one the Carmel Council buried?" I smiled. He remembered. "It's about everything," I replied, and in that moment, something stirred deep inside me. Not grief, not vengeance, purpose. The days that followed blurred together like brushstrokes on a canvas left out in the rain. I maintained the charade, sipping tea, feigning forgetfulness, stumbling when Daniel was watching. I became the woman they thought I was, fading, pliable, tired, but beneath the surface I was sketching a blueprint far more intricate than any home I'd ever designed. Victor and I began speaking daily, under the pretense of reminiscing about old projects. He quickly understood the stakes. He always had an architect's mind, naturally drawn to structure, layers, and risk. He never once asked if I was sure. He only asked how he could help. Meanwhile, Lillian had begun documenting everything, every pill, every label, every side effect. "They've changed your medication 3 times in the past month," she said one afternoon, as she handed me a small notebook filled with scrawled dates and notes. "Each time, you got worse." She looked at me with quiet fury, her voice cracking. I should have done something sooner. I placed my hand on hers. "You're doing it now." At night, when the house fell silent, I'd slip into my old studio and review the pills I hadn't swallowed. I'd begun collecting them in a hollowed-out art book, Modernism in the West, a fitting disguise. It had once been my Bible. Now it became my evidence vault. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I'd float down the halls slowly, deliberately, counting my steps, wincing when the lights flickered too brightly or the shadows stretched too long. Every creak in the hardwood floor was a question. Every silence, a potential trap. Daniel had made himself my caretaker, a role he seemed to relish, not out of love, but out of control. He handled my prescriptions, my bank statements, even my conversations with my physician. Dr. Lane, a friend of his from grad school, had replaced my trusted family doctor last year under the excuse of up-to-date care. "Your heart is fragile," Daniel would say with that same soft, practiced concern. "You need to trust me, Mom." But I had stopped trusting him the moment I saw the glint in his eyes when I mentioned revisiting my will. One morning, while Daniel was away at work and Rebecca was at her yoga retreat, Lillian drove me in secret to a clinic in Monterey. There, under the care of Dr. Charlotte Nguyen, a specialist Victor had quietly recommended, I underwent a full medical review. She examined me carefully, methodically. "You've been showing signs of long-term exposure to anticholinergic drugs," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "These aren't treatments, they're toxins, designed to mimic dementia, to weaken the heart." I stared at the chart in awe. Her hands, my own hands trembling, not from illness, but from rage. How much time would I have had left if I hadn't come here? I asked. She paused, looked me in the eyes. Maybe 3 months, maybe less. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply nodded, because part of me already knew. We arranged a follow-up in secret. She prescribed a tailored detox plan, and like an old building under renovation, I began slowly, deliberately, restoring myself. That evening, back in my studio, I pulled out an old charcoal pencil. My hands weren't steady yet, but the shapes came back to me. Arches, beams, shadow lines. But this time, I wasn't designing a home. I was designing a trap, one that would collapse only when they stepped into it themselves. And when it did, there would be no reconstruction, only justice. There's something sacred about the process of drawing, each line a commitment, each stroke a decision. In architecture, we don't build without a plan, and neither would I. It was February when the first pieces began falling into place. My recovery, though slow, allowed me stretches of clarity, windows of time where I could think, plan, remember. I timed my movements around Daniel and Rebecca's routines. Every Thursday evening, they went out for cocktails with their business circle in Pebble Beach. That was when I worked fastest. Victor, always the strategist, connected me with Michael Downey, a former financial crimes investigator from San Francisco, who now worked privately, helping elderly clients uncover abuse. His handshake was firm, his demeanor calm. The kind of man who spoke slowly and carried weight with every syllable. We met in the parking lot of an aquatic therapy center under the guise of a physical therapy session. Lillian, ever the guardian angel, drove me. As she pushed my wheelchair into the private consultation room, I could smell the faint chlorine from the pool nearby, hear the rhythmic splash of elderly swimmers attempting slow laps, unaware that in a nearby office, someone else was learning to breathe again. Too, me. Michael laid out a folder. It was thick. "Your son has been siphoning money in small transfers over the past year and a half," he explained. "Shell accounts, offshore banking. He's moved just over $2 million so far." My mouth went dry. I had known something was wrong, but seeing the numbers, my life's work disappearing like sand through fingers, was different. "And Rebecca?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Michael nodded solemnly and opened another folder. Photographs. Her laughing in a wine bar, touching the wrist of a man I didn't recognize. More damning, documents, property evaluations, architectural sketches. Her companion is Stephen Ralston, a high-end real estate broker out of Los Angeles. She's been planning to list your home, your studio, as a luxury showcase property. The transaction was tentatively scheduled for June. I looked down at the blueprints she'd altered. She had removed the north-facing garden to expand a walk-in closet, erased the reading alcove where Henry used to play cello. They were already spending my legacy. I should have felt fury, but I didn't. I felt clarity. That night, I sat at my drafting table under the soft light of the antique brass lamp Henry had given me on our 25th anniversary. I sketched quietly, methodically. Not a building, but a trap made of paper, signatures, timing, and law. Every design needs to understand its foundation, I murmured to myself, echoing the words I had told generations of students. Mine was compromised, but not broken. Physically, I was improving. My strength was returning in inches, not leaps. I could lift a mug now without trembling. But the real rebuilding was happening inside. My mind, long numbed by chemical fog, was becoming sharp again. A little slower, perhaps, but more focused than it had been in years. Victor, who now called every night at 8 mois like clockwork, became my compass. You always said architecture was the art of dignified defiance, he reminded me. So build something that lasts longer than their greed. We began drafting the first documents for the Barrett Foundation for Design and Ethics, a nonprofit dedicated to providing scholarships to female students over 40 pursuing second careers in architecture. What if they find out before we finalize? Everything? I asked. Then we're not ready, he said. Like in any good project, we wait for the concrete to set. So I waited and watched. Rebecca began hovering more than usual. Her smile, though still perfect, had started to strain at the corners. She'd enter my studio unannounced, casually glancing at the bookshelves, the sketch pads. "How are you feeling today, Evelyn?" she'd say, placing a hand on my shoulder. That lingered too long. "Still tired," I'd murmur, hiding the clarity in my eyes. "You know," she said one afternoon, tilting her head, "Daniel and I were thinking of updating the will soon, just to make things organized." I nodded with the faintest smile. The trap was working. What they didn't know was that the property had already been transferred to the foundation. The will had been updated, without Henderson, Daniel's college buddy, but with Margot Shepherd, my attorney of 35 years, one signature away from the checkmate. The game had begun, and I had never been more certain of my next move. March arrived with a cruel irony, brisk winds, blooming magnolias, and the illusion of rebirth. But not all spring is honest. Some things bloom just to lure you closer before the frost bites again. That's how I saw Daniel that month. Blossoming. With charm and sudden thoughtfulness, bringing me little gifts, asking how I was feeling more often than usual. He even offered to cook, something he hadn't done since high school when he tried to impress his first girlfriend with overcooked pasta. But behind every smile, I saw calculation. Behind every offer of tea, I sensed timing. I could feel it in my bones. They were getting ready to end it, and so was I. By then, my plan was complete. My strength had returned enough to walk without assistance for short periods, though I still wore the soft slippers that made my steps silent. Lillian had carefully arranged everything with Victor and Michael. Surveillance cameras had been installed discreetly during a weekend trip Daniel and Rebecca took to Napa, tucked behind crown molding and nestled into fixtures I'd designed. Myself, decades ago. I knew every crevice of that house, every shadow, every sound. So when Daniel arrived one morning with a new pill, slightly larger, faintly green, I didn't flinch. "Dr. Lane says it should help with your circulation," he said smoothly, placing the capsule beside my usual morning medications. I picked up the pill slowly, watching his eyes. The way they narrowed, the slight tilt of his head, the controlled stillness in his posture. A predator observing prey. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said softly. Then I placed the pill on my tongue, took a sip of water, swallowed. Or so he thought. I had learned, months ago, how to tuck the capsule beneath my tongue, holding it with the precision of an actress in a final scene. Henry had once performed in community theater. He taught me the trick with a sugar cube. I had adapted it for poison. Alone in the studio, I dropped the pill into a sealed bag. Lillian sent it to Michael for analysis. 2 days later, the results confirmed what I already feared. A higher dosage of the same drug. This time, designed to act faster, to damage kidneys, accelerate, heart failure. It wouldn't look like murder. Just a weakened old woman giving in to time. They were done waiting, and so was I. April came like the sound of footsteps on marble, sharp, echoing, undeniable. I met Victor at his penthouse, where I'd begun staying on weekends under the excuse of needing time away for rest. He'd created a space for me, sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the room in morning light. My drafting table sat by the corner, complete with the soft halogen lighting I preferred. It was here I tried on the dress, not just any dress, a crimson sheath with clean architectural lines and a neckline that whispered strength. It clung to me not as armor, but as declaration. "It's too severe," Victor commented gently as he adjusted the mirror. "Exactly," I replied, smoothing the fabric over my hip. "I'm not attending a funeral. Although in some ways I was. The death of the illusion, the burial of the obedient mother, the woman they thought was easy to erase. We settled on a look, the dress, a sleek bob haircut to replace my softly pinned waves, and a pair of low heels I could manage without stumbling. I practiced walking across the marble floor, feeling each step like punctuation in a letter they never expected me to write. The event was set, May 15th. Rebecca and Daniel, unaware that I knew, had begun planning a private dinner at the Camden Club to celebrate what they claimed was the anniversary of my first design award. But I knew better. Daniel was planning to announce his promotion at Northbridge Developments, a deal requiring the very funds he had stolen. "This is the moment," Victor said one evening, pouring me a glass of wine as we reviewed documents. "It's not revenge," I whispered. "I know," he said. "It's architecture." That night, I stood on the terrace of his apartment, the city lights glittering below, and watched the wind ripple across the bay. I thought of all the women I knew, friends, colleagues, even strangers, who had been erased quietly in rooms no one saw. I wasn't going to be one of them. Was going to be heard. May 15th was coming, and they had no idea what I had built. The evening arrived, draped in twilight and polished lies. May 15th. The Camden Club stood resplendent on the hill overlooking the Pacific, all glass and steel and curated art, exatamente o tipo de lugar onde Daniel e Rebecca se sentiam mais em casa. Elegante, exclusivo, mascarando a frieza com vinhos caros e toalhas de linho. Victor and I arrived fashionably late, not out of arrogance, but by design. By the time the maitre d' announced us, Mr. Victor Campos and Ms. Evelyn Barrett, every guest was already seated, and Daniel's discomfort had begun to simmer beneath the surface. I saw it immediately. The glance at his watch, the shift in his posture, the false smile that collapsed for a heartbeat before reforming. I stepped into the room as someone reborn. The crimson dress flowed with every stride. My silver hair, no longer pinned in soft curls but swept into a sharp, commanding bob, gleamed under the chandeliers. The crowd turned, forks paused midair, and for one precious second, the entire room held its breath. Daniel rose stiffly, his voice tight. "Mother, you look well." I met his eyes. Proper medication makes all the difference. It was a small sentence, but it detonated like thunder between us. Rebecca, ever the actress, stood and embraced me with practiced warmth. "You're glowing, Evelyn. We were so worried about you." "That's kind of you," I replied, pulling back slightly. though I'm not sure you were worried in quite the way you imply." She blinked. Her smile faltered. Just a breath. Just enough. The dinner began. Salmon tartare, braised duck, lemon soufflé, all meaningless. I watched the evening unfold like a choreographed ballet. The Carrington executives sat quietly, exchanging nods with Victor. Elizabeth Grant, now assistant district attorney, sipped water and tapped her leather portfolio. And then, as the final course was cleared and the champagne flowed, Daniel rose with his practiced confidence. "I'd like to share a bit of news," he announced, his voice filling the room. "As of next quarter, I'll be a partner at Northbridge Developments." Polite applause, smiles. Rebecca squeezed his arm, beaming. Then I stood, and the room fell silent. "Congratulations, Daniel," I said. "I too have an announcement." The servers, trained in advance, moved into position. At each place setting, they placed a thick, linen-bound portfolio bearing the gold-embossed emblem of the Barrett Foundation for Design and Ethics. Gasps, curiosity, then confusion. "Tonight marks the official launch of the Urban Renewal Initiative. In Monterey Bay," I said, voice clear, unwavering. "A $120 million project centered on sustainable design, community wellness, and legacy." Elizabeth stepped forward, handing documents to Daniel. "And this," I continued, "is the legal transfer of my residence, effective last month. The Barrett home and studio will now serve as the headquarters for the foundation, a permanent center for education and ethical architecture." Rebecca's champagne flute froze midway to her lips. Daniel turned red, then white, then something in between. "What is this?" he asked, voice cracking. "It's structure," I replied calmly. "Designed with care. And unlike your plans, Daniel, mine are legal, binding, and ethical." Elizabeth opened her portfolio. "And now, for a more urgent matter. Mr. Barrett, you are under investigation for financial fraud, elder abuse, and attempted medical manipulation. Dr. Lane has been suspended. Multiple statements have been collected. You may speak to your attorney, Daniel." Stammered. Rebecca backed away, eyes wide. I wasn't involved in her care," she said quickly. "That was all Daniel. I barely—" "We have recordings," Elizabeth interrupted gently. "And transcripts." The room unraveled like torn fabric. Guests began shifting, whispering. Daniel looked to me, pleading. "Mother, you don't understand what you're doing." "No," I said, rising to my full height. "You never understood who you were doing it to." Rebecca tried to slip away, purse in hand. "Mrs. Barrett," Elizabeth said, gesturing to a female officer in plain clothes. "She'll walk with you, no handcuffs. No yelling, just consequences." The rest of the night passed like a storm breaking over still waters. Quiet, powerful, final. By the time we exited, the moon had risen, casting silver light over the ocean beyond the glass. Victor offered his arm. I took it. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "I was myself," I replied. And for the first time in years, I meant it. May 15th had begun with a lie, but it ended with the truth. 2 months after the dinner at the Camden Club, the silence in my home was no longer terrifying. It was peaceful. Gone were the hurried footsteps outside my bedroom door, the hushed whispers, the routine delivery of poisons disguised as help. In their place, light, stillness, and a cautious but growing sense of freedom. Daniel was out on bail, living alone in a furnished apartment he could barely afford. The accounts had been frozen. The partnership offer at Northbridge Developments rescinded. His colleagues, once charmed by his ambition, now avoided his calls. Public sympathy? Minimal. The evidence was too strong, the betrayal too chilling. Rebecca, always one to pivot, had taken refuge in her sister's home in Santa Barbara. She claimed she had been manipulated. a victim of Daniel's influence. But the transcripts, the recordings, the bank transactions, none of them aligned with that story. Her plea deal was under review. Dr. Lane had lost his license. And though no formal charges had been filed against him yet, multiple families had come forward. Women and men who, like me, had suspected, but never proven, what was being done to them. Justice was no longer a dream. It was moving. Slowly, yes, but forward, and so was I. Victor had offered me his guest suite permanently, but I'd declined. I needed something new, something mine. The house that once held every version of me, from mother to wife to survivor, was no longer a home. It had been transferred fully to the Barrett Foundation, and its transformation had begun. The studio Rebecca had tried to claim was now a digital design lab. The formal dining room where Daniel had placed those deadly pills, it was being rebuilt as a lecture space for ethics in architecture. The first cohort of students, all women, over 40 returning to school after caregiving, divorce, grief, or simply decades of being told it's too late, had arrived in June. One of them, Maria, hugged me during orientation with tears in her eyes. "You gave us back time," she whispered. But in truth, they gave me something greater, legacy, rebuilt from ruins. My new residence, a sleek, low-profile home overlooking a quiet cove in Pacific Grove, was nearing completion. It was smaller, smarter, designed around my limitations without conceding beauty. No longer did I fear the tremors in my right hand or the occasional fog in my thoughts. I designed with them now. Victor had become more than a partner. Not in the romantic sense we once dreamed of, but in a deeper way. Someone who saw me fully, without projection or need. We dined often, collaborated on projects. Our past no longer haunted us. It simply enriched the present. One afternoon, as I was reviewing design submissions for the foundation, the front desk rang. A delivery. A letter. From Daniel. It had been over 6 months since our last contact. I opened it carefully. Inside was a simple note, handwritten in the familiar slant, that once covered spelling tests and birthday cards. "I'm eligible for parole in 18 months. I've completed counseling, education programs, and I'm writing about our story, about power, about failure. I'm sorry for all of it. I don't expect forgiveness. But I wanted you to know I've changed." I held the paper in my hands for a long time, not because I believed him, but because I believed in myself. I placed it in a folder labeled Unresolved, not to revisit, just to acknowledge. Some people are ruins, not to be restored, but to be studied, so we don't build the same foundations again. Later that night, Victor found me on the terrace. We watched the sky change, the ocean swell. He handed me a glass of wine and smiled. "You seem lighter." "I'm not carrying the dead anymore," I said, "because what remains after the storm isn't just survival. It's the power to rebuild. Differently. Intentionally." January 15th, exactly 1 year since I overheard Rebecca whisper those careless, fatal words. A year since I stood in my own hallway, heart pounding, hearing the quiet celebration of my supposed final birthday. And now, here I was, standing beneath the winter sun, facing a crowd of young architects, donors, city officials, and press gathered in front of the newly christened Barrett Center. For ethical design, a red ribbon fluttered in the ocean breeze. Behind me, 20 scholarship recipients smiled nervously, notebooks in hand, dreams flickering in their eyes. Lillian, now officially the Foundation's Director of Operations, stood at my side like she always had. Quietly, faithfully, with a kind of strength few notice until it's the only thing holding you up. A reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle raised her hand. "Ms. Barrett, after all that's happened, what does this moment mean to you?" I stepped to the microphone, feeling the wind stir the edges of my coat. Architecture, I began, is the art of possibility, of reshaping what was broken, of taking something that collapsed, whether a building or a life, and reimagining what it could be. I paused, scanning the crowd, letting them feel the weight of that silence. This home was once a site of betrayal. Now, it's a place of learning, of second chances, of women who were told they were too old to begin again, too late to start, over. I looked down at Maria, the student who once told me I gave her time. She nodded through tears. "There is no such thing as too late," I said. "There is only the moment you decide you deserve better." The ribbon fell. Applause rang out, but all I heard was the sound of the ocean in the distance, steady, timeless. I closed my eyes for a moment, allowing the wind to kiss my cheeks and the weight in my chest to finally lift. That night, Victor and I sat on the terrace of my new home, the house he helped me design, open spaces, soft edges, intuitive lighting, for when my energy faltered. Beauty and function, in harmony, we sipped tea instead of wine. He looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you regret it?" "No," I said softly. "Only that I didn't see the cracks sooner, but I was busy being who everyone else needed me to be." He didn't respond with words, just reached for my hand and held it. In the corner of the room, the third phase of the urban renewal project sat on my drafting table. My hand still trembled sometimes. Words still disappeared from my mind, like petals blowing off a branch. But I had learned to design around the tremors, to leave space for the forgetting, to embrace the reality of what is, not grieve for what was. The past is not a blueprint. It's a lesson. And every day I wake up, I choose to build, not just buildings, but trust, purpose, dignity. And if you're listening to this, maybe you're rebuilding too. Maybe someone tried to erase you, undermine you, make you feel small. But let me tell you something. You are not a ruin. You are the architect of what comes next. So build with grace, with courage, with love. And above all, build with the kind of strength that doesn't need permission to take up space. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this story touched something in you, I invite you to subscribe. Not because of numbers, but because every voice that joins this space helps amplify the stories that matter. The quiet, resilient, often invisible victories of women who refuse to be erased. To all the women rebuilding from the ashes, you are not done. You are just getting started.